Séamas Carraher, global writer and the poet. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Erem.
Thank you. So you have write a poem about Mr. Abdullah Ocalan. Would you like to share it with us before we start our interview?
The poem I have here was really for the World Resistance Day for Rojava on November the 2nd in 2019. So I'll read that, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
The title is Truly We Live in Dark Times, which is came from Bertolt Brecht. Truly we live in dark times. What kind of times are they when a talk about trees is almost a crime because it implies silence about so many horrors? Bertolt Brecht, to those born later, 1938. Truly, we live in dark times when the fate of 4 million people is decided by a handful of gangsters, when the voices of another 1,000 million stay silent, when under the flag of the butchers a handful of killers wait to unleash slaughter on humankind. Truly, we live in dark times when our world is shaped with only cunning and greed, and where words have been hung by their necks from lampposts or fall like drunken louts from the twisted mouths of politicians, while the bankers and the businessmen rub their grubby hands with glee. Truly, we live in dark times, when it rains fire and sharp steel on small children who ask you and me, why did you do it? And worse still, why do you let it be done? And worst of all, why are you so silent when I am in pain? Truly, we live in dark times. Now they even light the silence with fireworks and celebrities, while the world hides its face in front of a TV screen. We live in dark times, for I see now endless lines of people fleeing across the face of our desolate planet, while this handful of gangsters in expensive suits stand up for another round of applause.
Thank you very much for that beautiful poem. So my first question would be, how did you get to know of the Kurdish movement?
I suppose really my connection to the Kurdish struggle was through global rights. Basically, I was a bit shocked round about, I think it was about 2016, when the Turkish military invaded southeast Turkey, northern Kurdistan, and there was coverage really of the curfews in the cities there. Really, through my connection with global rights, I started really reading about the situation that the Kurds were facing. And I was shocked, really shocked, terribly shocked, because I had heard so little about the Kurds, about their struggle, and really about their marginalization in the international community. I mean, we've had a struggle here in Ireland that went on for a long time, but I mean, we got quite a lot of publicity about it. And, you know, while there was obviously a lot of oppression and a lot of complications, but it wasn't really, the struggle wasn't really conducted in secrecy and silence. And at the end of the day, we managed to secure a peace process, probably because the international community was so vocal and noticed so much the struggles and, I suppose, a lot of the barbarism that went on, a lot of the inhumanity. So when I encountered the Kurdish struggle, I was deeply shocked that I had heard so little about it. And then, I suppose, particularly around the Turkish military incursion into places like Diyarbakir, and then the terrible, terrible slaughter in Jazir, if I pronounced that correctly, I was just shocked that Turkey was actually allowed to just carry out such outrageous acts with so much impunity. So that was really, that was really the start of my interest. And while I'd been a community activist here, really struggling against poverty and a lot of the injustice that we have here in Ireland, I had more or less retired. I'd been a long time at it, and really a lot, I suppose, of the struggle here for a type of participatory democracy had probably been sort of worn down probably because of the successes, the economic success of the Celtic Tiger. So a lot of the grassroots movements had been a lot of the energy had gone out of it. So I more or less backed away. But a lot of the anger that kept me going, for having grown up really in poverty and with the type of oppression that poverty sort of lands you into when you're sort of born into that situation, a lot of that anger sort of came back. And when I started like hearing what was really happening to the Kurdish people, and I suppose since then, really, I suppose most of my involvement, because there isn't really much of a Kurdish support movement, as far as I know, here in Ireland. So a lot of my involvement has really been just to try and make a very small contribution towards ending the silence that, say, a country like Turkey or the Iranian regime as well gets away with in their treatment of the Kurdish people.
Thank you. Also, do you see a role for poetry in the liberation struggle?
That's a really complicated question, Erem, but I suppose my own view, having been, I suppose, a socialist my whole life, the 20th century has probably been the greatest disappointment for socialists. And in my opinion, a very personal opinion, not because we lost so many revolutions, which of course we did, but rather because of the fact that we won a couple of significant revolutions. You know, I won't mention the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, or even China. It was the fact that we won, and yet we didn't manage to bring a sort of the dawn of what Marx described as a human society into being, but rather we perpetrated just another sort of cycle of oppression, of, you know, the list is endless just of the abuses that went on. So I suppose that whole question about humanization, that as I went down the years, just really thinking deeply about my own contribution to the struggle, that this whole thing about humanization became so important. I mean, we can get the theory right. We can engage in a military struggle, which we've witnessed here in Ireland with all the complications it brings up. But at the end of the day, if our goal is not a human and a humane society and a very, very democratic form of self-organization, well, what's the point of it? And the 20th century, I think, proved that. And particularly for the left, just because, as I've already said, because it wasn't our defeats that really affected us in that century. It was the success and the terrible way we have used that success to create more oppression, rather than a sort of a human and a liberated society and a liberated human being.
Yeah, do you think the so-called international community is listening to the Kurds?
No, that's, well, again, I'm speaking from, I suppose, my own perception, Erem, here in Ireland. Now, I know we have a very small community here in Ireland. As far as I know, it's under 1,000, say, Kurdish people live here. And the few protests I have gone to, obviously haven't been too well attended, particularly by Irish people, whereas the Palestinian struggle would get an awful lot of publicity here and, I suppose, a lot of support. And that's the thing that, I suppose, shocked me when I started reading about what Turkey was doing in northern Kurdistan. And it's that silence, I think, that is probably a major obstacle to a resolution to the whole Kurdish issue. I mean, the situation of the Kurdish people was created, obviously, by the colonial powers. And in a sense, it's that international community who has created that problem, in my opinion, has a tremendous responsibility to contribute to its resolution and to contribute to make up for the damage that it has done. However, because I suppose in particular Turkey's role in NATO, the international community, just, it's business as usual. We don't want to affect our business deals with the Turkish regime. We don't want to damage our military links and whatever. And so the Kurdish people have just been sort of abandoned, tragically, and in a sense, very cynically. And the only way really to respond to that is really for people in large numbers, I think, to stand up and say that is not acceptable. And to me, because for so long I hadn't even heard of the Kurdish struggle, I think it's very important to end that silence in whatever way we can, and really to put the Kurdish situation in all the different parts of Kurdistan, to put it top of the agenda, because it is one of the major human rights issues affecting humankind today, in my opinion. There are many other issues, obviously the Palestinian situations, the Rohingya people in Myanmar at the moment. There's many situations, but the situation of the Kurds, particularly in Europe, because of our own sort of responsibility for creating this terrible situation, should be much higher on the agenda, in my opinion. And I find it shocking that it isn't. And I also find it tremendously shocking that a country like Turkey, in particular, which has such close ties to the European community, can be allowed to perpetrate the war crimes that it does on a daily basis. Now, obviously, we see it's perpetrating, the regime there is perpetrating similar crimes against its own people. However, it has been perpetrating these crimes against the Kurdish and other minorities within the old empire. And we just stand idly by. We just sit and sort of bury our heads in the sand. Totally unacceptable. That silence is just shocking, Erem. Very, very shocking.
What do you think of the Rojava revolution and of the governance model that they're proposing there?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, Erem. I've spent the last couple of years reflecting on this. And again, it's probably a question that needs an awful lot of reflection. And I don't think there's going to be easy answers. But to me, the great tragedy for left-wing people, or for progressive people, or even for just liberals that believe in democracy, in the sort of powerful drift towards the right that the world has been heading in, over the last, 20, 30, 40 years. The terrible challenge for us, in a sense, is the impasse that the fall of the Soviet Union, which was a positive thing, in my opinion, because there was very little progressive going on in the Eastern Bloc. But the fall of the Soviet Union sort of signified really the end of the momentum towards the type of change that the left believed in at the start of the 20th century. In a sense, I suppose, I'm being a bit long-winded about it, but in a sense, we had a path to follow at the beginning of the 20th century. And if you read the bits of history I've read, if you look at the German revolutions, if you look everywhere, right down to, I suppose, Che Guevara's campaign in Bolivia, there was so much energy, and there was a destination that we knew our destination as progressive people, as people who believed in a radical type of democracy. But over the years, and by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now we see what's happening in China, where the Communist Party is probably the greatest capitalist entity, along with the international multinational corporations today, we've reached this powerful impasse. People don't know. We have no map into the future. And again, I'm probably being terribly long-winded, but to me, having confronted that impasse to the best of my own ability, obviously I'm not a theoretician, I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a working class guy that thinks about important things. That impasse, in a sense, has been addressed. To the limited amount of reading I've done of Murray Bookchin and obviously of Ocalan, the fact that in northeast Syria, a way of organizing society has been put in place, and it's lasted, what, 8 years now, despite the terrible pressure it's been put under, despite the fact that it's working. I think that has tremendous importance for all of us, not just to offer a solution to the different type of crises we have in the Middle East, but as a role model for the rest of us. I know Subcomandante Marcos years ago in Chiapas, which we don't hear so much about now. To me, there was a great sort of spark was lit there, that it was possible to do things differently. It was possible to believe in a human future. Like, that was many, many years ago. And again, it seems to have drifted back into the silence. So to me, the people in northeast Syria, despite what they're suffering at the moment, what they stand for is a way through this impasse, and that we need to be taken on board the work that they're doing at the moment. We need to be learning from it. And even radically, I mean, the one, I suppose, simple analysis I had based, I suppose, on my own practice for the last 20 or 30 years as an activist, one thing I became very clear, that you could be on the left, but you could in a sense be very right wing on the left. And to me, the way of articulating that, it was this whole notion of participatory democracy. And so while there was many left-wing people who believed in a very centralized form of running things, and in a sense in particular where you have a military struggle, you can have an awful lot of centralization, and that seems to perpetuate a climate where oppression and abuse and inhuman sort of activity goes on. To me, the whole notion of participatory democracy has to be the door into the future. And the fact that it's actually happening at the moment, and again, the silence that surrounds that. I know people like Graeber, the guy who just died recently, I know he and many other people have written and tried to, I suppose, bring the whole Rojava situation into the mainstream media here. And to that small extent, we've managed, I suppose, to hear of it. But the profundity of what's going on there, to me, as a left-wing person that had to face the fact that the 20th century left us deeply impoverished on the left, that we had a century of, in a sense, abuse. We created police states. We created, as in Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So to me, when we try and take all that on board, the whole situation now, the Kurdish liberation struggle, particularly what we're witnessing in Rojava, is the door into the future. And I'm profoundly shocked, again, from my own very personal position where I'm sitting. I'm shocked that that hasn't been taken on board.
As you know, Kurdish leader Mr. Abdullah Ocalan is being isolated, and he's not being able to meet his basic human rights last 21 years now. What do you think Turkey is trying to achieve with isolating Mr. Abdullah Ocalan?
Again, probably a very complicated question, Erem. I suppose that the way I would look at it, it's simply fear. I mean, the direction, I suppose, that the AKP regime in Turkey has gone, I don't understand, and whether the peace solution process that lasted, I suppose, for a short while, some years back, whether that was genuine or not. Obviously, since 2015, you know, the regime of President Erdogan has headed in a very, very narrow and destructive direction. And I think anything that would challenge that extreme right wing, I know some people use the word fascist. I'm very hesitant about using a word like that, but extreme right-wing direction, authoritarian, dictatorial. I think that the direction that the regime has gone in Turkey in the last couple of years, I think it's based on fear. You know, we can see now that the regime in Turkey not alone fears the Kurdish people or the Kurdish liberation struggle, it actually fears its own people. It actually fears its poets and its writers and its politicians, anybody who says anything at all. I mean, we're looking at a very, very narrow-minded authoritarian society. And so the isolation of someone like Abdullah Ocalan obviously just ties in with that, because Ocalan has become the figurehead, I suppose, for a much more progressive and enlightened form of discourse. And that has to be an enormous threat. And I think to maybe summarize that isolation, in a sense, that path and the intensity with which it's pursued, and as it takes a sort of a shape in the imprisonment of someone who's willing to contribute to a much needed peace process, I think that will secure the downfall of that very narrow-minded regime. I think they are just biding time, because they're signing their own, I don't want to use the word death warrant, it sounds too militaristic, but they're just walking themselves down a dead-end street. And I think eventually people are going to have to wake up. I mean, obviously the European Union, in a sense, has woken up, because the prospect of membership in the European Economic Community, is becoming almost non-existent anymore, just because of the European response to what's going on in Turkey. So in a sense, while it's a very negative that Abdullah Ocalan and all the other types of oppression, it's very negative what's going on there at the moment, I think it's also positive to the extent that you see a regime that's existing solely in fear and will do anything to hold on to power. And that, we've learned in history, that's a sign or a symptom of the end. So hopefully there is hope and light on the horizon.
Could you also please comment about the Turkish state's policy on the arresting journalists, poets? As you mentioned, Turkey is like an open-air prison for the journalists and the activists as well. Do you think Turkey is a democratic state? Very short, very briefly, please.
No, I think the analysis now, I mean, I think the rest of the world is trying to catch up really with what's happening in Turkey at the moment. I mean, obviously when President Erdogan, when he came and his party came to power, I mean, there was hope in a sense, with the sort of complicated history that Turkey has. There was hope that Turkey would, in a sense, modernize in our understanding of the terms, particularly more along democratic lines. That just didn't last long. I mean, whether it's the cynicism of political parties, whether it's this whole system where power is centralized, I mean, there's probably as many reasons as not why it happened. But obviously what's happening at the moment is just part of what has been going on the last couple of years, and it's part, I think, of the sort of the political model that we're using, in a sense, is because if power is the goal, well then hanging on to power becomes so important, in a sense. And if you want to hang on to power, in a sense, the price of hanging on to that power is going to be paid by the rest of society. Because democracy, the more I think about it, again, as a socialist, democracy, while it has its sort of cliched, sort of taken for granted aspects, but if you look at what democracy really means, not so much in the way we use the term now, but in terms of freedom, what it means for us to coexist in our societies, democracy becomes so very important, in a sense, as a sort of a rule of thumb, a map, a guide, not to what we have now, but to how we are going to continue to relate to each other into the future. And I think somewhere like Turkey proves that if we don't continue to develop democracy and what it means, we're going to head backwards. And what we see with President Erdogan, what some writers, as far as I can see, are beginning to write about now, this man would like to move back into what is now called neo-Ottomanism, but he would like to move back to a period of empire. He'd like to move back maybe 100 years into the past And I think it was Marx made the joke, if it was a joke, that, you know, history has a tendency to repeat itself. The first time as tragedy, in a sense, which we've already witnessed, in particular to Turkish history. But the second time, he said, as farce. And despite the terrible suffering that we see in Turkey by so many of the Turkish people at the moment, despite that, someone like Erdogan and his party, really, in the bigger picture of history, it's a farce. There's no way the world is going to head back to a period of empire. We may head into darker times, you know, and we don't know the shape those times are going to take, but we're not going to redo the Ottoman Empire. I mean, we can see the American empire beginning to collapse at the moment, and on and on. So unfortunately, to come back to your question, Erem, I think the Turkish people are unfortunately paying the price. You know, it's the people, you know, who value very simple things that are core aspects of democracy, like free speech, like the ability to create and to argue and to disagree and to differ. The Turkish people who value these things, in a sense, are paying the price, because there is a price, I suppose, for these things. And it is that we continue to develop open types of societies. It's that we move in a certain direction. And while there's probably no particular boundaries to define that direction, we have learned by now that repression and authoritarianism and dictators and all of that stuff is not the path forward. And so it's a great tragedy that the Turkish people right now are actually paying the price, because they're standing up for something that has value. What always comes back to my mind is really the poetry, and I suppose the bit of the life story I have read of Nazim Hikmet, the poet, who in a sense was very cheerful about the fact that he spent most of his life in a Turkish prison. Why? Because he just wanted to speak the simple truth. And at the same time, which is the thing, I suppose, that helps me, he had a tremendous love for his own people, for the Turkish people, and in particular, the Turkish sort of working class, the simple people, in a sense. And he had tremendous hope for the future, you know, and I see that that's, you know, the bits I managed to read in the media, I see that that hope is still alive and it's still there, you know, in the internal struggle and in the people who stand up at a powerful, tremendous cost. I cannot imagine myself personally not being a particularly courageous human being. I can't imagine what it's like just to be living in Turkey at the moment, where just to stand up and say something very simple, you know, could cost you so much. So I have a tremendous admiration for the people there and for his writers and just for anybody who takes the ability to speak freely seriously.
Dear Séamas Carraher, global rights writer and a poet, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for your comments.
Erem, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.